So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk a bit about some foundational code or some JavaScript foundations that we're going to help leverage in our applications. And we're going to help extend what our declarative components are capable of doing. Now, as I was building this, well, I guess I'll get to that in a second. So the foundational components that we're going to look at, we're going to understand what exactly is a callback and how to use them. We're also need to look at what exactly is closure. From there, we're then going to go ahead and take a look at the actions interface that AJAX provides, and then some tricks and tips that we can use to kind of make those actions available globally throughout our application. And what I was getting at just a second ago, while I was building this or putting this together, I kind of had a moment where I realized that I'm going to be talking about a lot of ideas and concepts where if you weren't exposed to those before, then it would really make the next part or part of the discussion kind of confusing. So the first bit of discussion is not going to be specific to Apex or APIs, but they are essentially a requirement to be able to use many of the APIs that Apex provides. And I generally, those topics are generally referred as scaffolding because you need those in order to get to the other good stuff. So without further ado, what is a callback? A callback is something that is used all the time in JavaScript, and I'm sure if you've written any sort of dynamic action or just applications that you built or any APIs that maybe you've used, in there, I can almost guarantee is going to be some form of callback. And maybe you didn't understand exactly why you had to write the code that way or why it's there, but it is absolutely required. And the way you can think about a callback is it's something that will happen later. And we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. Oftentimes, it is used in conjunction with waiting for a user to do something, right? Because we're not in control of the user. They're going to click and interact with the screen. And as they interact with the screen, essentially we want to respond to them. And as they perform certain actions that we think are important or should cause something to happen, then we'll have our callback be invoked. And generally speaking, a callback is defined as some sort of named function. So you're going to see kind of a function created, and then we're also going to see that function referenced elsewhere. We're going to kind of pass that function kind of into another function, and that syntax or that style looks kind of silly. So let's go ahead and take a look at one of the first ways in which we can use a callback. You can see that in this example, we have a notify function, and it will perform an alert, and it says it is time to do the thing, whatever the thing is. And we are going to use a built-in construct called set timeout, and we're going to say, go ahead and use my notify function that I just created, and go ahead and call it in about 5 seconds, or in it's almost exactly 5 seconds, but it's never exact. Yeah, so you will notice that when the page runs, we kind of queue up this notify, 5 seconds will pass, then notify will display. Just to kind of observe what that looks like, I'm going to hop over to my application over here and go to callbacks. And we're going to go ahead and just look up a basic alert. You can see I clicked the button, and then 5 seconds later, you can see that I get this alert that says that something has happened, or it's time to do the thing. Another way that we can use callbacks, and this is, I think, more accurate, is that we can generally provide parameters. And if we go back to the previous example, you can see that my notify function does not take any parameters. It just says the same thing every time. Well, if my second version of the notify function, we can see that it takes in a task name, and I'm using a template literal here to kind of reference that task name in this string. So you can see there's a little backtick. And if you want to kind of bind a value into a template literal, then you use $ curly brace, and then you can reference a value here. And of course, you need the respective closing curly brace. How is it receiving this information? Well, check this out. When we look at set timeout, we're still calling the notify function. We're still saying it takes 5 seconds before we invoke it, but we're passing a third value. So what I want to convey here is that this third value kind of gets passed in here to task name. And that was kind of, and task name is then going to be used as, so it's going to be important task, and important task is going to get bound into the string. Let's see that in action real quick. So, and let me go back to my normal cursor there. I'll say alert with parameter. And now we see that it says, it is time to do an important task. Okay, great. I also get these questions when I do these webinars like this. Oftentimes I'll have some examples that are pre-built, or sometimes I'll fire up the console here to demo something to you. And I've had some feedback, which was, hey, can you make sure to actually show us the code so we can see what it looks like? We will go ahead and make this application available, and I will, I guess towards the end, we'll look at a couple of the actual code examples. One thing that I want to point out, kind of bringing this kind of more in line with the APEX API discussion, I have another notify here. It's been kind of updated a little bit. But this time, I just want to point out that I'm using apex message.alert. Up until this point, I was just using the built-in browser alert, which is just going to look the way that my browser thinks it should look. But it's actually probably a better idea for me to use apex message.alert for just standard messages that I want to throw up to my user. And I want to point out that the alert actually has its own callback. So this is kind of interesting because I have set timeout, which is going to call notify. Notify is going to display an alert on the screen, and it's actually going to register its own callback. So after the user closes that dialog, I have yet another callback. And notice I'm using the apex debug.log API, and this is just going to log some information to my browser's console. So the moral of this story is it's possible to chain multiple callbacks together. Let's go ahead and observe that. And the other thing that I want to point out, so we're going to wait a second for this to open up, is that notice my alert kind of matches what's going on with my theme. And if I open up my console, and we look kind of down here, when it's the second I close this, ooh, actually, we didn't get any information. How come I don't see what's going on? Well, actually, I was expecting to see some information, and I can see that, let me go ahead and put myself into debug mode, see if that changes anything. Apex alert. Say okay. Ooh, and I'm not getting my my alert logged. I must have busted something. Oh, I'm sorry. This particular example didn't use the callback. If I open the second example that actually uses the callback, say okay, aha. Now we see that the notification was closed. Helps if I actually read the buttons that I'm clicking. So I just want to point out that that doesn't, we don't have to just send a notification or just log a piece of information. You may have noticed in a recent version of Apex, session timeouts were enabled. And I'm sure you've come back to your screen and you've seen an alert that said your session has expired. And then the second you kind of acknowledge that your session has expired, it can attempt to get you, take you back to the login screen. So that's something that you could do with that callback that you associate with the alert. And then the other thing that I want to point out about callbacks, and something that you need to watch out for, is that depending on how you register those callbacks, and I mentioned that you can have, you can chain several callbacks together. Well, what if you have kind of the same function being called over and over and over? You can kind of create these infinite loops of callbacks. And so in this example, I'm going to have a function called askQuestion. And notice I'm using the Apex message.confirm API. I'm asking my question, and I'm giving it a handle response callback. If we look at the handle response callback, I just want to point out that it takes in, or it receives, a parameter called OK pressed. Well, you can name that parameter whatever you like. I think OK pressed makes a lot of sense because that's what's in the documentation. We can then check to see if that is true. So if they did press OK, they acknowledged it, then I'm actually going to set a little timeout, and I'm going to ask the same question again. It calls askQuestion brings up the dialog. It then says handle response. We come back here, and we kind of end up in this kind of circular reference. Notice that there is an escape condition here where I have an else, where I guess if you don't say OK, if you just close it, then I'm going to show, I'm going to use the Apex message API yet again to show a success message and say, OK, fine, no more messages. Let's just take a look and see how that works. Play Apex confirm. And then here we can see that it asked the question, would you like to see this again? OK, sure, great. And it's going to take a second. OK, and I can sit here and I can click OK until my session expires. Or I can say cancel, and it says, OK, fine, no more messages. We'll get out of here. The other important piece of scaffolding that I need you to understand is I think it's a very important part of development with in JavaScript, is understanding what exactly is going on with closures. And I was trying to think of the best way to explain this, and ultimately I settled on that these are just, a closure is essentially a value that's available to your function, and it will always be available to your function. And another way that you could think about it is we're basically creating a memory for our function, something that it can remember and hold on to. And so wherever that function goes, it also has that little memory that it takes along with it. And it kind of gets, when you create your function, that closure ultimately gets created. It kind of locks all that information in like a vault, and it has its vault of memories that it takes with it. But what does that actually look like? Okay. So in this example, I have some little code snippets here. We're going to kind of progressively build up. And I'm not expecting everyone to be a master of closure after this whatever 10-minute discussion on closure. But I just want you to be aware that it exists and give you the term that you can Google to kind of go out and learn more. And also, I will say that if this seems like something that's interesting to you, we do have in our JavaScript fundamentals for Apex developers class, where I kind of go over this stuff in more detail. So let's start from the basics. We have a function called greet, and quite simply, it's just using the Apex message API to say hello. Let me go ahead and pull that up here. I say greet, we see hello. Okay, fair enough. Similarly, I could redefine greet where it takes in a parameter, and I'm going to go ahead and pass that parameter to alert. So This time I invoke greet, but I actually provide it the greeting, and that gets forwarded to my alert and presented to the screen. Let's take a look. Greet with parameter. How are you today? Fantastic. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit interesting. So what if we wanted to have a core definition of what it means to greet? In this case, what it means to greet is to invoke this message dot alert. And no matter what type of greeting we present, whether it's a rude, nice, friendly, whatever type of greeting, that's how the message needs to be delivered. So one way that you could approach this is I could actually define a rude greet function and a friendly greet function. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's totally fine and acceptable. But just note that I've kind of duplicated my logic of how I perform a greet. Now, in this case, it's just one line of code. It's very simple. It's not complex. There's not a lot of business logic or anything applied to this. I'm just trying to kind of focus on the core concept here. But you can see we kind of have a rude greeting, you need a haircut, and then a friendly greeting, which is, hey, I love your style. And so if I click on those respective buttons, they'll invoke these respective functions, and I see their message. And just to show that in action, I say rude greet, it says, you need a haircut, and then friendly greet, hey, I love your style. All right, so now what I want to take a look at is, well, how could we look at reconstructing that in a way to where I kind of define what it means to greet someone one time, and I kind of use that as a template to make multiple functions that provide greetings. Now, this is where it gets kind of silly. So let's take a look at this function here, make greeting, and I'm doing something kind of bizarre. And a function is allowed to return a value, right? So if I had an add function that accepts two numbers, it says number 1 plus number 2, it returns that value. That's something I think everyone can relate to and has seen and experienced. But when you return a function, that gets a little bit, that's a little different. And that's really not something that we can do in PL SQL. So one of the things that I want to point out, and there's a really important piece of information here, is that notice the function that I'm returning does not take any parameters. That's the important piece of information here. But when I call this make greeting function, it does take a parameter. And the glue, the closure that's happening here is that when this function gets created, it is going to create a memory. It is going to remember whatever that original greeting was that it received. So take a look at this. Rather than, I am creating two different functions, but what I'm doing is I'm actually calling the make greeting function to kind of manufacture or produce a brand new function that has some functionality kind of bundled into it. So I have my rude greet and my friendly greet. So ultimately, I end up with the same functionality as up here, but I have a central definition of what it means to greet, and I kind of made different references to that. I don't have explicit buttons that I can click on to do that. You just need to trust me that that works. Why would you do this, right? Why would you use this closure to return things and remember things? Why is this helpful? So I have an example here, and I kind of I wanted to use some previous concepts that we looked at. Earlier, we were looking at set timeout. In this code, I'm using set interval. Set interval is almost exactly the same as set timeout, except that it keeps repeating. So rather than waiting 3 seconds and displaying the message one time, it's going to wait 3 seconds and display the message, wait another 3 seconds and display the message, wait another 3 seconds and display the message, and it's just going to keep going forever. An important piece about set interval is that I can also clear an interval, but I have to know what the identifier is for the interval that I wish to clear. And it also just so happens that set interval will give me that identifier. So I need my greeter to remember what the interval is. And so I went ahead and made a interval ID value, and I'm remembering the interval as the interval ID whenever I start, and I'm going to clear the interval ID whenever I stop. So now I kind of have this pretty cool thing that I can do where I can make essentially like an instance of a friendly greeter, and friendly greeter is going to be given 2 functions, start and stop. And I can invoke those whenever I'd like, whenever it makes sense. And start will kind of start the greeting messages, and then stop will obviously stop the greeting messages. And I can very easily tie those to my buttons. And now I want to show you how this is configured, where exactly the code goes and how it's wired up, because I think this has a little bit of complexity to it that I want to explain. So where does this code go? If I edit my page, I go to my page properties, and at the very top of my page in the global variable declarations, if I scroll down to the bottom here, you can see that I've made my function make greeter, and this is the code that we saw just a bit ago. And you can see that I'm starting up my greeter here, and it says today is a good day. Notice I have these little comments here that are not, no, they're commented out. This is basically just showing me the 2 functions that I can use to start my greeter and stop my greeter. But I don't want this to just run right away. I don't want it to start and stop. I want it to rely on interactions from my user. So I want to call start and stop from a button. What does that look like? Well, I have 2 buttons here. And if I look at the execute JavaScript code for this button, it says friendly greeter.start. And if I go to my other button here, it has friendly greeter.stop. Let's see what happens when we interact with these buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and start my greeter, and it takes like 3 seconds per tick. And I say, today is a good day. And then I should get again, today is a good day. And then again, I get today is a good day. And it's going to keep going and going and greeting. And this is a little bit silly. I don't want to keep at this. So I'm going to try to play a little game where I get all these closed. And then, okay, I'm kind of done getting these messages. So I'm going to stop my greeter. Oh, I'm not getting those messages anymore. The important takeaway from this is that I used closure to remember that interval ID. And notice in my dynamic action, where I execute my JavaScript code, I'm not passing any values in here to stop. And same for start. I'm not passing anything in there, right? I don't have to tell it what to start or what to stop. It has already remembered what exactly what that value is. Okay. And again, it's stored here in that interval ID. And you can see in both the start function and the stop function, they both reference the interval ID to make sure that they function correctly. All right. So those were our scaffolding topics. Not Apex specific, but I tried to tie in some Apex APIs for you while doing that. Come back over here. The next thing that I want to talk about are the actions interface. And actions are essentially a vehicle for us to register callbacks to Apex components. And what's interesting about this is we can provide some metadata that allows us to normalize different pieces of information about those actions. And we also can provide, I should have put here, essentially we can put an identifier for our actions, and we can reference those actions from multiple components. What does that mean? Well, let me show you in the builder here. Actually, a really good example of this is we can see this in action right here in the builder. And notice if I go to the right-hand side here, I have these menu options that I can click on, one of which is expand. And if I click on expand, you can see that the screen becomes bigger. And then, of course, I can come over here and say restore, and it kind of now shrinks back down. Well, it would be foolish to have to write that, whatever that code is that's handling that, multiple times. I should have to write it one time, and then I could invoke it from potentially multiple places. So it turns out that I have a little button over here called expand and a button called restore, right? These are basically actions that have been defined, and this is just a button that references this action. Okay, so how do we do something like that, and where else does this type of thing show up in Apex? Let's hop over to our application, and I'm going to go to my employees here. And this is an interactive grid. And I have an actions menu, and I have several different options that I can select in this menu. Now, I want you to think about what the interface would look like if we didn't have this actions menu. We would have just this giant list of buttons that we could click on, and I don't think I really want that. But there might be some actions that you want to invoke, right? Maybe you want to be able, actually the number one thing that gets asked for is already here, is reset. I just want one button that I can click on to reset my report. But notice if I go to actions, report, there's an option here called reset. So I don't want to have to write my own code to make that happen. How do we connect these two things? Well, I want to show you something that I think is really interesting. If I come over here to this reset button, and I'm going to go ahead and inspect element. It does take me to the toolbar, which is holding the button. So let's go ahead and expand that. And here, I can see that I have a button, and I just want to point out this property right here, data action reset report. That's kind of interesting. That must be doing something for me. And the other thing I want to point out is this little class, JS action button. These two properties are doing something that I think is very, very interesting. And to replicate what this is doing, I have a little snippet of code that I'm going to put in my browser here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm using my Apex API, and I'm saying, hey, Apex, can you go get a region for me off of my page? I've provided a static ID to this interactive grid called IGEMPS. It's going to go ahead and find this interactive grid. I'm then going to ask my region to give me any actions that are kind of have been registered to it. And then I would like to go ahead and invoke specifically the reset report action. Actually, I feel like that would be very helpful at this point in time. So to give you something to actually see, I'm going to add a filter here for analyst, right? So I have a total of 2 rows. And when I invoke this, notice that the report resets. Now, the important thing to know here is I just had to say which action to invoke. I did have to say for which region, right? So I did have to know, okay, go get this region, and then go ahead and invoke a particular action on that region. But I don't really have to know what exactly it means to reset the report. All right. So when should we start looking at these types of solutions? Well, I want to go ahead and I want to talk about buttons here for 1 second, and I want to make sure that we understand there's 2 different types of buttons that are common throughout Apex applications. There's the redirect button and the submit button. And if I change the value of this item and I click a redirect button, that takes me right back to this page. Notice that the value doesn't save. But if I click a submit button, notice that the value does save. I think it is totally fine and wonderful and valid to keep using redirect and submit buttons. I think the vast majority of buttons that you create in your applications are likely going to be these types, and you should continue to make them. One thing that I've observed is maybe a little bit of the gross misuse of dynamic action buttons when they aren't really necessary. So just, I guess, as an aside, just remember that your tried and true redirect and submit buttons are still wonderfully awesome buttons, and you should use them. All right. So how do we present multiple actions to a user? So you might have previous, change, edit, and next buttons in a button container at the top of the screen. And I would say that I think this page looks just fine. And then you might get some feedback from the user that says, hey, I have this list of actions that we want to be able to perform. And really what happens is it kind of, these actions are going to creep in kind of one at a time. I say, well, we want to be able to do this, and then we want to be able to do that, and then we want to be able to do this. And so after a year or so, or maybe years of this application growing and features getting added to it, let me toggle the build option. We end up with this situation where we have a whole bunch of actions kind of lined along the top. Now, in this case, maybe this is acceptable, right? Maybe all of these actions are things that the user does. Kind of, it's an even distribution. They're just as likely to change job as they are to promote. And they do this, maybe they do this a lot. So maybe you could justify this user interface. Maybe many of these options they don't use very often. And so what I believe is happening here is I'm kind of creating some visual clutter in my application, and I want to try to reduce that so it's easier for my user to try to understand what's going on here. I have gone ahead and I have created a very special button here called toggle build option. And I've also created a build option that will allow me to kind of swap between 2 different views. This isn't a JavaScript API, but it is a PL SQL API. And notice that when I click this, boop, you can see that my actions kind of adjust a little bit. And I also want to point out that I have a promote action here, promote action in this menu, and I also have a promote action down here on my page. Okay, so several different locations. And at the moment, if I click on promote, nothing happens. If I click down here, nothing happens. And if I click here, nothing happens. So what's going on there? Well, what if I want to enable it? Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change my job to clerk. And notice that promote kind of becomes active, and also promote becomes active here. This UI wasn't updated. That's something that I should work on. But if I click promote, you can see that I get an alert that says promote. And if I go here, I get an alert that says promote. And if I go here, I get an alert that says promote. This is just trying to demonstrate that I have 3 different controls. This is a declarative menu. I have a declarative button, and I have an entirely custom button that I've kind of injected into my item post text that I can reference. Okay? All of them invoking the same action. How did that come to be? Well, let's take a look. When you are creating an action menu, there's a couple things that you have to do to make it happen. The first is you need to create a list, a declarative list in your shared components, and it's going to be a collection of labels and links. And there's some properties that we're going to pick when we do that. We're then going to create a regular declarative button, and this is going to be the control that kind of initiates and holds this menu onto my screen. And then there are some properties that we are going to configure to kind of connect the button and the list together to make sure that things get invoked correctly. And this is actually all documented inside of the Universal Theme application. If we go to the menu pop-up entry, you can see it shows you how to create your list region. Okay, and it then tells you how to configure your button. I already went ahead and did this, and but there is the link to do that. And if you want to find it, if you come to the Universal Theme sample app, there's an option here called Menu Pop-up. Go to Menu Pop-up, and then you're good to go. Okay, so what does that actually look like, though, in our application? Okay, oops, let's go ahead and edit our page. If I scroll down to the very bottom of my screen, you can see that I have this list called employee actions that has been created. And I can see that it is type list, and I can see the source is employee actions. If I go to my attributes node, or attributes tab, it's no longer a node over here. Need to work on adjusting to that. I'm really happy it's here in 22. Notice that the list template that I picked is menu pop-up. And one of the most important things that you have to do if you want to use this, or if you want to use the actual actions associated with this, is there's this little checkbox right here called Add Actions. And you have to make sure that you click it. If you don't click it, then the actions are not going to get built as you would expect. Okay, so I created my list. How do I get this to bind to my button? Well, it's always a good idea whenever you create a list or any component that you plan on using in your application to give it a static ID to uniquely identify the component. If I go look at the button that I want to bind this menu to, kind of the invoker of this menu, if you will, I have a button here called Employee Actions. And you can see here, I have a couple settings that I think are very important. I've given this the class JS menu button. I just for aesthetics, I gave it the chevron down, which is that little down arrow. The button is defined by a dynamic action. And what's most important is right here. I've gone ahead and I said the menu that I want to bind to this button is employee actions underscore menu. Where did this name come from? Underscore menu is a constant that's always going to end with underscore menu. But employee actions came from the name that I gave my list region. So let's go back to our list region just for a second. If I scroll down, I can see I have my static ID of employee actions. So therefore, employee actions underscore menu is what I use to bind to my menu. Well, how do I configure the different actions? What do those actions actually look like? Well, if, let's actually go over here to my page shared components. And I should see that I have lists here, and there are my employee actions. If I go ahead and edit my employee actions, let's just see what's in here. And at the moment, my target for this is just alert promote. And if we go and we look at this, okay, my target is alert promote. But if I scroll down a little bit more, you can see that I gave this an identifier called emp promote. I then gave it a title called promote employee, and then I gave it a shortcut, Control/EP. This is what's known as a sequential shortcut. Whenever you see these commas in a shortcut, it means first you do this key combination, then this key combination, then this key combination. And this will allow us to produce a shortcut. Let's go ahead and say apply changes. Or actually, I didn't change anything, so we'll say cancel. Now, if we go and we look at our actions, we can see that it actually is listing out Control/EP on promote. One thing I guess that's a little unfortunate about the CSS styles here is that if I mouse over it, it's kind of hard to see that shortcut. But anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and do that shortcut. It's Control/, and my hands are off the keyboard. E, hands are off the keyboard. P, promote. Right? So I didn't really have to write any code to create these shortcuts. There's infrastructure already in place to deal with them. Cool. The other thing that I might want to do is maybe I have a shortcut or something that I want to be available to all pages. And it's like a universal thing that always needs to be available. And I have one that I've created to send an email. And so I'll do Control/E, and then I'm going to get this alert, send email. And if I did this correctly, I think I did, even if I'm on my home page, I'll do Control/E, and then it says send email. It doesn't matter where I go, this action kind of follows me around. Now, generally speaking, try not to overload your application with thousands of actions that are always available everywhere. There's probably going to be a handful of actions that are fairly common. Maybe to get page level help, right? That might be a pretty common one. Give me the help for this page. Where do we create those, and what does that code look like? Well, check this out. If you want to call the actions interface directly, I'm going to go edit my application. And I actually did this on the global page. So let me head on into my global page. Let's go look at dynamic actions. And I made a dynamic action called register global actions. The type of action that it performs is execute JavaScript code. And I guess I should also clarify that register global actions is just fires on page load. That's it. And what does this look like? Well, here we're calling Apex actions.add. We're providing a name to identify this action, a label for if we happen to want to make a button or something that links to this, we can. Here's my callback function that I have to provide. This is what's known as an anonymous function. It doesn't have a name. It's just kind of written in line, and that's totally acceptable. And then I'm also providing a shortcut. I'm not providing an icon or anything like that. I could maybe provide more of those options, but I'm just not doing that now. And with that, I have actions that are available throughout my application. As a reminder, don't forget to enable actions in your list menu. If you do not do this, you could do everything correctly, but if you don't go into your template options for your list and turn this on, then the actions will not work. Let me just show you that explicitly. We're going to go to too many actions. I'm going to go to my list. I'm going to go to my attributes of my list, and I'm going to open up my template options, and there it is, add actions. Normally, it's going to look something, I think it looks about like that when you first create it, and I go ahead and turn these on. The callout is like the little triangle looking piece that kind of points to the button where the dialog was opened from. So if you don't want the callout, you can turn that off. I like it, so I leave it on. There is one last piece that I want to mention is actions don't always have to be on and running. You can actually disable actions. And if you notice, when I ran this page, notice that promote is disabled, but when I changed job to clerk, promote became available. How did that happen? Well, let's take a look. If I go to my dynamic actions, I have a job changed dynamic action, so on change of the item job. I do have a condition here that's looking for president. So if it's president, I want to do something a little bit different. So if it's true, I'm going to say apex actions dot disable emp promote. That's the name of the action that I registered. And if I come down here to false, I'm going to say apex actions dot enable emp promote. Hey, not bad. So I'm kind of integrating my dynamic actions with my the actions interface to achieve my end goal here. The last thing that we can do, and this is, I'm almost done here. Oops, let me go back to page 4. Okay. I talked about using closure before. So I have a function here called observe action, and it takes in an action and an operation. I am looking for if the actual action that has been fired is equal to emp promote. Then I want to go ahead and toggle the disabled state of my custom component. And this is kind of that weirdness that we were looking at before, where I'm actually kind of making my own observer. And so the way that this works is I'm going to feed it a control on my screen, and I'm going to interact with that control on my screen and kind of disable it or enable it in some way. So I'm using closure to be able to solve that problem. How did I wire this up? You can see that I'm creating a reference to my button, and I'm going to tell Apex Actions to register an observer, and I am making an observer which kind of allows me to respond to changes and update that control as I see fit. And if I go and I look at my button, and again, I can put this anywhere on my page. It doesn't matter where I put it. And I think I put it next to salary. Okay, there we go. You can see that I added, my custom promote button just embedded on my page somewhere. The important thing that I had to do is I said that this is an actions button or a JS action button. This kind of registers the action infrastructure to this control. I provided some classes just to make it look a little nicer. And then finally, here, I went ahead and added the data action emp promote. This is the glue that binds this action to that original promote. So that's why, save and run. When I click on this, oh, I guess I need to change my job to clerk. I kind of have an action that's the exact same as this declarative promote and this declarative menu option. They're all doing the same thing. So in summary, callbacks are functions that are going to be called sometime in the future. We don't know when. Right? Generally, it's for some sort of asynchronous thing. We're kind of cast it out, and then we wait, and then sometime in the future, we invoke it. Closure kind of creates a sort of memory for our function, so we can refer back to values that are helpful for us. And then, of course, we can create actions to kind of allow the same functionality to be invoked or initiated or called from multiple different locations. And remember, those locations can be declarative buttons, menu options, or even completely custom controls that we write our own HTML and bind to it. That being said, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you got a good couple good snippets. Please stay safe and healthy out there. And Lino, I don't know if we have any questions, but we got a couple minutes.
Nothing at the moment, Tyson.
All right. Well, if there are no questions, thank you so much. Please stay safe and healthy. And I will see you around on the next one. Bye for now, everyone.
Thanks, Tyson. Thanks, everyone.